Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today I'm going to talk about the first 4 chapters of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. This is part of a series of videos in celebration of June Eyre, which I'm making alongside Steve Donahue, who's doing a read aloud of the entire novel. If you haven't seen my general introduction, or either watched Steve's read aloud of these 4 chapters, which he completed last night, or read the chapters on your own, you might want to do that first. At any rate, let's jump right into these initial 4 chapters. I'm going to look at the very first line of the novel. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day. Right off the bat, we get the theme of restriction or limitation. We'll see this idea of restriction throughout, but in this case, Jane says she was pleased about the restriction, not resistant to it. I was glad of it, she said. I never liked long walks. She might have been glad of it, but the reason why she felt that way was because she was, as she explains, physically inferior to her cousins with whom she lives. As we'll hear repeatedly, Jane is not only plain but small, something true for Charlotte Bronte as well. Jane lives with her cousins and her aunt, or aunt, as the rest of you might say, because her parents died when she was quite young. Her uncle and his wife took her to live at Gatewood, and then the uncle died. So Jane was first orphaned by the death of her parents, and then sort of orphaned again when her biological uncle died, leaving her with an aunt by marriage who did not want to treat her as family, shall we say, despite her promise to her dying husband that she would raise Jane as one of her own. Orphans are really useful for authors, especially orphans without deeply committed caregivers. Main characters who have no family members have to be in charge of themselves right off the bat in many ways, no matter how young. They're the dominant force in their lives, something that isn't necessarily true for children with parents and perhaps siblings as well. In addition, these isolated orphans without loving caretakers have usually experienced a kind of trauma and suffering that can drive a story along. We'll see that here. Jane wants to find a home. She deeply wants to be loved, and just as much she wants to love someone herself. We see this throughout the novel, including here in the Gateshead section in chapter 4, where Jane takes her doll to bed and says, quote, "Human beings must love something, and in the dearth of worthier objects of affection, I contrived to find a pleasure in loving and cherishing this doll. I could not sleep unless it was folded in my nightgown, and when it lay there safe and warm, I was comparatively happy, believing it to be happy likewise." What she wants here is connection, a relationship with someone who will love her, but also someone she can love. The only long-term connection she's even close to having in the Gateshead section is that of substitute mother, a motif we'll see again in this novel. Mrs. Reed is obviously a totally unsatisfactory substitute mother, never offering the love and care that Jane craves. Bessie, on the other hand, is something of a mixed bag. Jane accuses her early on of being chiding and cross sometimes. There are certainly times when she doesn't really acknowledge how Jane feels, most significantly when the apothecary visits and Bessie overrides Jane's thoughts, presumably to protect the Reed family's reputation. But despite her moments of disinterest, Bessie also expresses some real moments of care for her. First, Bessie's the one who surrounds the young Jane with stories. Some are from fairy tales and folk tales, while others come from popular novels of the day, including Gothic lit, and specifically a novel including master-servant romantic relationships that turns out in a way that we'll see echoed a bit later in Jane Eyre. Later on, Jane recognizes Bessie's skill at storytelling. She had, as Jane says, a remarkable knack of narrative. I suspect Jane recognized how much that knack had rubbed off on Jane herself, the supposed author of this fictionalized autobiography. Jane falls in love with those stories, and that almost certainly was at least part of the reason the home's bookshelf became such a refuge for her. Starting right off in the very first chapter, Jane has hidden herself away in a window seat with Bewick's History of British Birds, a big illustrated volume that Bronte's readers would have known. Jane is drawn to the pages about birds who live in extremely rugged habitats. And Steve Donahue, in his reading of the first chapter over on his channel, makes the observation that these, quote, forlorn regions of dreary space mirror the land that Jane herself sees as she looks out over the moors from her window seat. I think I would add that she also might be fascinated with these habitats not only because of the similarity to her world, but also because of the distance from it. She's craving escape to adventures beyond the home in which she's constrained. Another example of her interest in other lands might be her interest in the travel novel Gulliver's Travels, where Gulliver travels to locations where he also doesn't quite fit in. The young Jane assumed that Gulliver's Travels was, quote, a novel of fact. Steve pointed out in his reading of Chapter 3 that many readers thought Swift's novel was fact, which I didn't realize. Of course, it's especially clever, I think, for Bronte to allude to that little controversy, since Jane Eyre itself was often taken as a true autobiography, as I mentioned in the introductory video to this June Eyre series. So I wonder if Charlotte Bronte, by referring to Gulliver's Travels, was making a little nod to the confusion about fact and fiction that surrounded her own novel and its, shall we say, autofiction? Near the end of this section of 4 chapters, Jane talks about reading the Bible. Here, too, what she loves are the stories. Genesis, some of Exodus, Samuel, Job, Jonah, Book of Daniel, etc. What she doesn't love? The Bible's poetry and platitudes. I think this shows us something more than just her love of stories. In the scene where Jane talks about her preferences, we see 2 things. 1, that she's absolutely steeped in traditional Christianity. And 2, we see the first real articulation that Jane Eyre is already committed to a faith that is personally meaningful, not a religion based primarily on doctrine. So let's go back to Jane in the breakfast room with its bookcase on that cold day that starts chapter 1. While the rest of the family is together in the adjoining room, the little girl finds a place for herself in the window seat, nestled between the curtain and the window, while she looks through Bewick's birds. Her aunt has restricted her from joining in the larger family gathering, because she thought that Jane did not show what Mrs. Reed considered a natural, happy, quote, childlike disposition. Jane was unhappy and willful, so she isolates herself in the equivalent of the family library, hidden from view. But soon her cousin enters the room. The young John Reed, only son of the owner of Gateshead, is the first overbearing male we meet in this novel. But he isn't the last one. Although he can't see Jane in the room, his sister quickly points out where she must be. John insists that Jane come before him, and he strikes her, apparently with his hand. Eventually, he demands that she give him the book she was reading, saying that it belonged, or at least would belong, to him as soon as he inherited the Reed estate. Jane, he told her, had no right to read it without his permission. And he threw the book at her, not only hitting her, but knocking her down, causing her to hit her head against the door. Despite the pain, Jane fights back, first verbally, which we'll get into in a moment, and then when John responds to her verbal attack by pulling her hair and grabbing her shoulders, she responds physically. We readers know that she joined the physical fight, but not with the kind of details that we know about how John attacked her. Instead, Jane just acknowledges that she, quote, received him in a frantic state, but didn't even know what her hands had done. Jane is physically attacked first before she fights back, but Mrs. Reed doesn't seem to believe that her son could act like that. Of course, even if she did suspect he'd provoked his cousin, it was a completely different matter for a girl to be involved in a physical fight than it was for a boy to be, perhaps especially a boy who was, pardon me, the heir of the Reed family estate. Jane Eyre is not the heir. Got that? Let's go back to her verbal attack on her cousin. Let me read what she says. "Wicked and cruel boy," she starts, and then she goes on. "You are like a murderer. You are like a slave driver. You are like the Roman emperors." Jane then tells us that she had read Goldsmith's History of Rome to learn about emperors like Caligula and Nero. Later we hear that she thought of herself as a rebel slave, resisting the injustice she felt the Reeds displayed to her. She's even told that John was her, quote, young master, a word that referred not only to the man in charge of a house, but to the owner of slave plantations, such as the ones in North America. The existence of chattel slavery and Britain's role in it was a significant issue in the era when Jane Eyre was released. We'll see more of Jane's references to slavery and to, quote, mastery as we go forward in this book. The concept of mastery is fairly multivalent, actually. It's a sign of power over other people, but also a sign of power over oneself. The Jane we're introduced to here is determined and passionate, and she hasn't yet learned to have any sense of control or self-mastery over her emotions. Still, Jane's passionate nature here is linked to her commitment to fight for liberty and equality. Two of the big themes of the French Revolution that were very much in the air in England when Bronte was writing. And within just a few paragraphs, the narrator is talking about France. And I think I would argue that she does this at least partly to make the reader make that connection. While Jane's personal morality might have been connected to her passionate nature, passion was also often seen as radical and dangerous by broader society at that point. So, in her rage, Jane fights back physically, and when adults enter the library, presumably after hearing the squabble, Jane alone is blamed. Mrs. Reed, or maybe someone else, says something like, "Did you ever see such a picture of passion?" And she orders Jane to be removed and locked away in the Red Room, where her uncle, the only one in the Reed family who treated her with love, had died. Jane continues to resist, and one of the people who transports her says, "She's like a wild cat." She's also referred to as a mad cat. Note that while others frame her intensity as madness, she herself frames it as social and political, primarily about injustice. But keep the scene of Jane being called the wild animal and the mad cat and her being confined in a separate room in your mind as we go forward, because Charlotte Bronte will refer to it again and again, both explicitly and more subtly. Terrified, Jane is locked in the bedroom. My understanding is that bedrooms during the period typically had locks with keyholes on both sides, operated by a skeleton key. For privacy, someone could turn the key from the inside and no one else could enter. If the occupants were leaving the room, they could lock it from the outside, maybe to protect valuables, etc. So locking the door from outside doesn't seem strange to me at all. Sometimes this kind of lock from either side is referenced in letters and diaries from the time, and it appears in period dramas sometimes as well. Left alone in the room, Jane begins to calm down a bit, although she is still very angry and still very frightened. She's in physical pain, too. Quote, "My head still ached and bled with the blow and fall I had received," she assures us. Readers may wonder if she might have received a concussion or some other kind of brain injury when the book hit her and she fell. As the late afternoon turns towards evening, Jane sees a light from outside, reflecting on the wall, clearly moving, and it intensifies Jane's fears. As they skyrocket, her world starts closing in on her, possibly the beginnings of faintness. She cries out wildly, and Bessie and the other servant enter the room. Miss Reed soon joins them. Jane pleads for them to let her out of the Red Room and punish her in some other way. When Miss Reed refuses and leaves and locks the door behind her, Jane is utterly distraught. And then, as Jane writes, "I suppose I had a species of fit. Unconsciousness closed the scene." We readers don't know precisely what fit means here. One early meaning can just mean basically a nervous collapse, a panic attack. In this kind of context, I tend to think of the word as meaning she had a seizure, which sort of fits, so to speak, with the idea that Mrs. Reed was willing to call the apothecary to look in on Jane. I don't know for certain that fit was used in that way in the 1840s, but Dickens did use the term shortly afterwards to refer to episodes that he describes as writhing and foaming at the mouth. And interestingly, at the time, seizures seem to have been associated with anger and even violence, to the degree that people with epilepsy were often automatically assumed to be violent criminals. This question of fits and seizures happens again in the book, as so many things do. Keep an eye out for it. Incidentally, I looked this issue up online, typing in Jane Eyre's fits. The results were about, and I quote, "the timeless cottagecore and dark academia aesthetic inspired by the titular character's wardrobe." Fit as in outfit. To style such an outfit, one should use simple fabrics such as cotton or wool, as well as minimalist details like lace-up boots and heavy cloaks and subdued bonnets. Well, I don't think that's what Charlotte Bronte had in mind. Anyway, this is a really gothic scene, in a way, all the way down to her fears about ghosts and the supernatural. But at the same time, what's happening is clearly realism here. We readers recognize that it's anything but supernatural. Jane herself is the ghost she thinks she sees in the mirror. Remember in the intro I said to keep an eye on mirrors and mirror images? There will be more. Chapter 3 starts with an interesting image. Jane has just awakened in a different room in bed, feeling that she had a frightful nightmare. There are a number of references to dreams in this novel, and we'll talk more about them later on. By the end of that first paragraph, though, the frightfulness of the time in the Red Room seems to have dissipated. Jane feels the hands of someone else trying to lift her to sitting more tenderly than she had ever felt. She rested her head and, quote, felt easy. Within a few minutes, she realizes that she is in her own bedroom, attended by both Bessie and a man she recognizes, the kindly town apothecary, Mr. Lloyd. She found this all soothing and comfortable and even protective. And that is the basic point of this third chapter. We see these two people treating her with kindness, really for the first time. I won't repeat all the details, but after they all get some sleep, Bessie brings Jane a special treat, a tart, served on a special plate Jane had long admired, but never before been allowed to touch. And next, Bessie offered to bring her a book, since she knew Jane loved to read. Jane, the narrator, tells us that the word book acted as a transient stimulus, and she asked Bessie to bring her Gulliver's Travels, which I mentioned earlier. After Jane put down the book, Bessie sang to her as she sat beside Jane's bed with her sewing. We don't know what exactly led to Bessie's extra gentleness and generosity in these moments. Was it just seeing how frightened and then how, quote, ill Jane had been the night before when Bessie admitted to the other servant that she was afraid Jane might die? Or did she see something of the mistreatment that Mrs. Reed had bestowed upon Jane? Perhaps even an ugliness in Mrs. Reed's reaction to Jane's illness. We don't know. Then Mr. Lloyd returns and treats Jane with not only gentleness but with curiosity and respect. He really listens to her and begins to understand the dynamics of life with the Reeds. He soon suggests the possibility of Jane enrolling in a residential school, to which Jane responds positively. She's heard some miserable stories about experiences in residential school, so that's not what drew her in. Why was she interested? Well, what she says is that she appreciated the accomplishments the students acquire at these schools, including the ability to paint landscapes and flowers and to speak French. And as the narrator summarizes, school would be a radical change, an entrance into a new life, as she says, away from Gateshead. We readers don't see the machinations that convince Mrs. Reed to send the young Jane to school. But when we come to chapter 4, which takes place a few months later, Mr. Brocklehurst from Lowood School has come to the house in order to interview Jane. We'll learn quite a bit more about the Lowood School in the next section, the decision to send Jane there, as well as the nature of the school. But for now, we know that Brocklehurst is as bad a man as his name suggests. I say that, but I suppose there really isn't anything about Brocklehurst's name that makes him sound evil. It's just that I first heard the name when I first read Jane Eyre as a girl. Bronte casts him as the big bad wolf. What a face he had, now that it was on a level with mine. What a great nose, and what a mouth, and what large, prominent teeth. Mr. Brocklehurst's interview with Jane includes the discussion I mentioned above about how much Jane read the Bible. He's appalled that she says she does not like Psalms, and asks her what she knows of hell and how she's going to avoid eternal damnation. Jane's answer doesn't go over very well. I must keep in good health and not die, she says, after a brief deliberation. Now, I assume I am not the only person who laughs every time I read this line, but Jane means it in the most honest way she knows. Instead of lying and saying she'd love to memorize a psalm, mostly to receive the reward of sweets, as the man's son does, Jane believes her behavior could indeed land her in hell, and she can only come up with one way to avoid that fate: stay alive for as long as she can. Mrs. Reed then warns Brocklehurst about the girl and her, quote, worst fault, a tendency to deceit. Despite Mrs. Reed's warnings, and despite his own irritation with Jane, Mr. Brocklehurst is ready to admit her as a pupil, which happens in just days. Whenever I read this line about the tendency to deceit, I think about a quote from one of my very favorite short stories, Eudora Welty's hilarious Why I Live at the P.O. At one point, as the first-person narrator recounts her sister attributing a line to the wrong person, the narrator says directly to the reader, "Do you remember who really said that?" Here in this scene, we get something similar. Mrs. Reed says Jane is a liar, but we already know who is actually the liar here. But it's only by claiming that Jane spreads deceit that Mrs. Reed can assure that Brocklehurst won't believe Jane if she says anything bad about the treatment she received from Mrs. Reed. After the man finally leaves, Jane and Mrs. Reed are suddenly alone together, something that hasn't happened in a very long time. The two of them have a massive confrontation, and it takes a somewhat unexpected turn. Steve has a fantastic discussion of some of the big elements of this scene, and I encourage you to go listen to his thoughts on this. I'll try to leave a link down in the comments to that particular section of his video, and I really hope you'll watch it. The one thing I will add is suddenly Jane Eyre stands up for herself in careful, confident words rather than the meltdown she was having before. "I am not deceitful," she says directly to Mrs. Reed. She recognizes she has other faults, but not deceit. She doesn't immediately accuse Mrs. Reed of lying, although she eventually gets there. Jane goes on to say a lot of what we might now label as, quote, her truth. For example, how about this? "I am glad you are no relation of mine. I will never call you aunt again as long as I live. I will never come to see you when I am grown up," etc. Of course, just because Jane's comments and predictions are not deceitful does not mean they are not inaccurate. Or, to turn it around, just because she's truthful doesn't make her correct. Nevertheless, saying all that directly to Mrs. Reed gives Jane a feeling she labels as exaltation. It gives her, as she says, the strongest sense of freedom and triumph that she's ever felt, and that she had found a path to liberty. And then, after Mrs. Reed left the room, Jane stood in her triumph for a moment more, and then began to feel remorse. After just a little more time, Jane recognized what she called the madness of her conduct. She became aware of the dreariness of what she called the hated and hating position. Our Jane Eyre is growing up. To wrap up, let's think for just a moment about how the adult Jane narrating this book, as she looks back on these scenes of a 10-year-old Jane, might be feeling. Does she think of the young Jane as an out-of-control child? Yes, I suspect she does. Jane's long efforts to learn how to control her passion is a theme throughout this book. But at the same time, I think she also sees some of the best parts of herself already present in the youthful Jane. She's deeply honest, deeply committed to telling what she feels is the absolute truth, even if she knows it will get her in trouble. She's unwilling to fib or lie in order to appease those in power. And I think the adult Jane finds that important and moral and meaningful. Well, that will do it for today. Thank you so much for joining me. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.